So last November, I led a discussion on communities of practice, and we had a slideshow, and we were kind of going through it. And I'll say what happened is that I was at the Office of Personnel Management, and we were building communities of practice top down. And one of the things that kind of popped up is we had one fellow say, well, that's not really how you want to build a community of practice. You want to do it grassroots. So I thought, okay, let's just ditch the PowerPoint and actually have a discussion. So we had a discussion about it, and we decided, okay, it was a really fruitful discussion. Let's continue it again. And I think tonight we're going to talk more about the grassroots building of communities and the idea of psychological safety. And a weird coincidence tonight, guys, I actually got contacted by someone yesterday if I could send them my manual that I wrote in 2013 for building communities of practice. So I haven't touched that in years. I mean, probably 5 years, right? Looked at it and said, wow, I left out a bunch of stuff. I really want to revise this. And I noticed that, yeah, again, that top-down approach versus the organic approach is one of the things we were talking about, and the real strength of psychological safety. So want to open it to the floor. I'm just going to facilitate and just make sure everyone gets heard equally. And, people can contribute. And if you don't want to come on camera and you don't want to talk out, you can certainly contribute in the chat. I have that open, and I'll be glad to read that out. So who wants to start? Jamie, you just recently did your work on communities of practice. So do you want to talk a little bit about your research?
Sure. So my research was centered around the social work community has now 13 grand challenges of social work for the United States. And one of them is eradicating social isolation. And in that pursuit, I ended up focusing on active duty military suicide and how basically, what are the factors that contribute to suicide in this particular group, which is, primarily people, male 18 to 28 or so, because they, among other groups in the country, kind of have these elevated rates. Already, unfortunately, there had been a trend of two things. There had been a trend across the world in increases in social isolation, and certainly in the United States. And then that just, of course, got worse with COVID-19. So, my challenge was sort of figuring out, okay, well, what's really going on here, and how can we look at these problems and how we're preventing them in a different way? So my work ended up kind of focusing on promoting connectedness, which is one of the primary, and in some researchers' minds and in their data, one of the best ways to prevent suicide is to build social connections, make sure that there is community. And in that process, I talked to a lot of different people. And one of the people I talked to was Catherine Woods, who is in the UK. And she just happened to introduce me to the work of Peter Block, who is really big in community. He wrote a book called Community. He also wrote another book called Abundant Community. But so that got me really curious in this idea of, well, if I look at communities of practice in the way that I've been taught to look at them and the way that I've worked with them professionally, we're talking about people who get together to work for a specific purpose in a specific context. Communities in Peter Block's terms, and in this kind of new way that I've been thinking about it, and other people have been thinking about it, newer, not brand new, is just more about not so much what is the group doing together, but first and foremost, how is the individual showing up in the group? How is the individual showing up in a community? And how is the community supporting that individual's ability to show up in that group the way that they are? That definitely is related to trust and psychological safety. So that's kind of where I'm at now, is looking at all the different research that talks about, well, when we do form communities, what, have we been looking at this kind of upside down a little bit, because we always talk about what's the goal, what is this community trying to do? And on the one hand, that's great, because, groups come together for a purpose, typically to work on something. But there's also this whole other element that has to do with understanding how, individuals sometimes are not self-aware of what they're bringing into a group, whether it's their biases or filters or backgrounds, whatever it is. And there's some interest among different groups of people in really focusing on that aspect of community, not just the technicality of how do we, what platform do we use and, how do we convene in that sense. But so that's where I'm at right now is looking at individuals and how groups encourage individuals to become more self-aware in the process of forming community.
This is super interesting. The psychological part really intrigues me, and it's reminding me of stuff that in my previous job to this. We looked at psychological safety in the workplace. I want to say a few things. First of all, this approach, I've always worked in knowledge management, and working in the USAID world, they've introduced this notion of adaptive management in international development. I know some different organizations are working on it, so that's where I am right now. And it's this approach called collaborating, learning, and adapting. So knowledge management would be like one part of that. So it made me think in the CLA framework, part of it talks about enabling conditions. So what are the conditions that make sure collaboration and learning, social learning and adapting are possible? And it boils down to, in their framework, culture. Is there openness? Is there trust? Things like that. Is there a culture for learning? Processes like knowledge management processes, and then resources, whether it's money or skills or whatever. So that's what's kind of pinging for me. And I want to introduce to the discussion without taking it in another direction. But what I'm thinking about also is what you said, Bill, about the kind of top down and bottom up. And I've always really believed in, you have to kind of suss out and get to know the people of this community and start to understand what motivates them, what incentivizes them. And that's always been the most interesting part for me and what I focused on, less than over having like a specific work, we have a work goal or something like that. I've always wanted it to be like this organic, learning community. However, in this company I'm in now, they've seen, I guess leadership has seen a need, an opportunity for a community of practice. And how many times, I'm sure, have we all come across that, where I would rather see it happen organically. And like you said, Bill, have an event or two, not call it something special, but just we're going to have a discussion on whatever the topic is, and then wait for people to say, this is really helpful. Could we plan another discussion like that? And then it grows right on, itself. So I'm wondering, like, I would love to be able to focus on those, the psychological safety and cultivating like that trust in the group. But if it's kind of it's coming from up above, it's very supply driven. So like, how can we do both things at the same time is my question for the group.
I'd like to jump in. I think the psychological side of community, whether it's communities of self-help or support communities or communities of practice, is really interesting, kind of what motivates people. And I think as community professionals, we haven't spent a lot of time on the individual, on what motivates them. I think this question of psychological safety is really interesting as well, and it has bedeviled the development of communities of practice at the World Bank, which have been pretty much top down, in that someone's decided we need a community of practice, go and build one. The issue I find with the World Bank is that it's not an organization of sharing. It's very old school in knowledge is power. And my own theory is that it's because it has such an academic background. The people that work there have at least 3 degrees, if not 4 degrees, and there's a few Nobel laureates wandering around as well. And their credibility and their status is all about their published work, and they rarely want to give attribution to someone else. That this is their work and this is my theory, especially economic theory, and I'm not sharing. If you want to know, I've interviewed people and they've said, well, you just wait a year and you can read my book and you'll find out what I'm working on. And that's the complete antithesis of collaborative learning and sharing. I think the second thing in terms for the bank, anyway, I'll just talk about the bank because I think it gives a practical example of the importance of culture. I come from the software industry where fail fast forward was the mantra. You know, fail and admit it and build on it. At the bank, there is no admission of failure anywhere. The only stories you can give are success stories. Maybe you'll get an occasional challenge written in towards the end somewhere very quickly, but there's no, hey, we tried this, it failed. I guarantee you will not find the word fail or failure in any written reports of the bank. And we produce thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. So there is no culture of psychological safety there. And the only way around it is when things start from the ground up and a small group of people who do trust each other can come together and build on that. It's been very hard to build true communities of practice at the World Bank and its partners as well. The communities, you know, we have over 400 communities of practice, and a lot of them are with partners in multiple countries, and they have ministers of finance and ministers of education. You know, you guys have all dealt with this level of I won't call it patronage, but in the involvement of people at the highest level. And again, so there's a reluctance to share that. So I'll stop that. But this question of safety is really incredible. It's incredibly important.
Mhm.
I kind of want to throw in here that so we're talking about World Bank, and the other day I had this conversation on this new Clubhouse app. I don't know if you're familiar with this. It's an interesting thing.
Mm.
But you know, the app itself started with mostly people who are entrepreneurs, VCs, and the way that they promote this app is very like exclusive. So, you know, it's invite only and it's in beta and all this. And I wanted to go in there because they're creating communities and all you can do is talk. So it's voice. There's no texting, there's no video, it's just voice. So it's like ham radio, some people were saying. But you know, over time, over the last year, they've built all these communities in there, which I thought was really interesting. So the other night I was in a conversation with someone, his name is Nick Sonnenberg, and he's a CEO and a co-founder of a company called Leverage. And what they were talking about in the room was this idea of self-managing companies and cultures and self-managing companies. And in my mind, having come from working in the government, you know, having working in traditional companies, you know, I think of the same problems that Ray just brought up, you know, this idea of, you know, structure and, you know, people not wanting to share, but their entire conversation was really about all these young serial entrepreneurs who start these companies that are completely taking advantage of what they call the human cloud. So every employee, every team is virtual, mostly in other countries. And, you know, the way that they work together, my assumption was, okay, well, if you're kind of working virtually and it's these, you know, really fast companies that are going, like, they probably don't care too much about culture or, you know, knowledge sharing. They probably just kind of do their own thing, but they're really all about community and all about building these very strong cultures, which I found really fascinating because I just didn't think that that was the direction that this conversation was going to go. And they were talking a lot about how do we build community and trust in this culture of togetherness among all these people who don't work at all together. And that involves a whole lot of trust, a whole lot of sharing, just the absolute opposite of what I think that I'm used to, you know, in these kind of traditional environments. So I think it's interesting to explore, you know, and be aware of the fact that, you know, while we do have all of these, you know, kind of traditional companies and organizations that many of us still work in, and they're kind of struggling right now in some ways to figure out how they deal with a more virtualized workforce. There are also all these organizations out there, and they thrive on this uncertainty. They thrive on this virtual way of being, and they build full communities, and they prioritize trust and culture and psychological safety. It's just fascinating. And I think that there's a book that I got at recommendation. It's called The Human Cloud. That's probably a good read if you're interested in this trend.
I'll just say one thing about the traditional companies and things. If you use Yammer, there's a great analytics tool called Swoop that sits on the top of Yammer, and Swoop is very proactive in publishing the results of hundreds of thousands of Yammer communities, and they kind of came up with statistics that I really thought were kind of confirmed what I was seeing. Is that one thing that COVID has done, it has forced companies, even traditional monolithic bureaucratic companies, to communicate more and over communicate, where groups were very tight. Now it's like nobody knows kind of what's going on, and so they have to communicate more. And there was this huge spike in Yammer activity, about 4 or 5 times the amount of activity. But the interesting thing, and of course they thought, the Yammer people thought, this is fantastic, but they've discovered over time it's like going back to what it was. And now people have got a clue about Zoom and Teams and how to work offline. People are retreating back into their silos. It's really interesting how the culture of a company is so overwhelming. And when I first started in community, I was really fascinated by different companies I interviewed to see how they were doing community. And so a company like SAP, very hierarchical, very rigid. They have 6 communities, whether they're developers, customers, their major enterprise customers, whatever it is. There were 6. At Autodesk, where I work with, a very democratic country, we had hundreds of communities around the company, but grassroots, democratic, and the communities didn't talk to each other. So we kind of recreated the silos, but at a more informal level. But the culture of the company and the organization is really crucial if you want to develop communities or communities of practice. I won't conflate the two, because I took communities of practice as just a type of community. They're not the be all and end all.
Hello, Turo. How you doing? Turo, can you unmute yourself? How you doing?
I'm doing fine, Bill. Thank you.
Yeah, so you just kind of jumped in here. So we're talking about the continuation from November. I don't know if you were in our November meeting about communities of practice. So we talked about that in talked about top-down communities, bottom-up communities, organically growing communities of practice. And we're focusing on psychological safety. So do you mind introducing yourself? Tell us where you work at and your interest in knowledge management.
Well, I'm Turo Dexter. I work at the Federal Transit Administration, which is part of USDOT. And for a few years, I've been the convener of the federal KM community, which Tara is an esteemed member of, and looking forward to developing a little more governance of that very independent community where I even hesitate to say quasi-governmental. I wanted to turn this into a nonprofit just to get out from some of the regulations, but there is a desire to stay in this nebulous space in between formality associated with getting a charter from OPM or somebody. The group was originally started, it was part of this, it was under the CIO Council, I think. But we moved away from that, and we're just a bunch of people who get together on work time, and some people tell their bosses that we do, and some of us don't. And we exist to support the practice of knowledge management and the improvement of the discipline in the federal government.
Very cool.
And Tara, were you there today?
I was not. And unfortunately, my job, I'm so busy in my job My last job, I had a lot more time to do things. I wish I have to see if I can find time, because the conversations that I had when I've been able to attend the the federal KM meetings are just wonderful. And
Yes,
I
you
learned so much. So I miss them.
Yeah, well, we miss you too. Yeah, well, I think of communities almost always in the bottom up way. I know you covered this last time, but
Mhm.
how do you, what are examples of top down communities that work?
Well, I built some for the office personnel management. I used to work at the office personnel management. So I built some top down. So, and I was just actually talking about a manual that I wrote then, and I just sent to a friend of mine. So we have a charter, we have designated roles, we have ways we do discussions, and our biggest, um, I guess, reason for doing the communities of practice that way, we wanted to harvest knowledge. So we wanted to get a group of bright people together, create what I call artifacts. So, like, if you're familiar with the Project Management Institute, they have the project management body of knowledge, and almost a lot of these professional organizations create these bodies of knowledge. And that was what we were doing in OPM, and specifically with something called HR Stat,
Mhm.
which was human resources statistics. You may be familiar with that. And we were doing a community of practice also just in general on training. And we were just getting people together, really bright people together, have them talk a lot, and work together to collaborate on building an artifact for us. So that's kind of the idea with the top down.
So developing the body of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. But what time frame was that? What circa?
That was I was at OPM. I was there for 5 years or 6 years, and that was 2012, 2013. So 2013, 2014. Yeah. Mhm.
Not terribly long ago. You know about the current initiative to develop a KM job series?
Oh yeah, and Tara can tell you more about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I remember when I talked to the organizational psychologist there, they said, well, every job series has knowledge in it. I'm like, well, okay, now we need to think about how we define our terms here.
I've often find myself saying knowledge management is in a lot of ways just good management. It's particular practices that we choose to shine a light on because there's a lot of payoff, and you can, you know,
Yeah.
think about them in the same way. It's a package of management techniques, and a lot of us are doing it. Most of us don't call it knowledge management, and that's one of the issues with the OPM project. Tara has heard me say this. There's so much knowledge management by another name going on out there.
Yeah.
That, are you practicing KM? I don't think so. It doesn't ring a bell. I don't think we are. Well, that organization might be doing some of the best KM around. They just don't think of it that.
Well, it's kind of comes from the same thing with training and development. I'm very active in that community and with training, and a lot of it is knowledge management in how we do things, and they just don't refer to it as such.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But that
So our
makes the
topic-
OPM project, the KM job series project, that much more difficult.
Yeah.
Because, how do you it's going to involve a conversation with people in the HR department probably
Mhm.
in a lot of to find out whether an organization is doing it or not. I think it's
Mhm.
and I know full well OPM is not doing that.
No.
Is
And
part
being an HR person, I tell you, knowledge management's kind of a new idea. I mean, we had a speaker last year from Deloitte when they did their HR trends, and one of the most surprising chapters was they talked about knowledge management. And a lot of my folks, my friends in HR were like, what in the heck is this about? Why do we need this? And isn't this just record keeping? I know. Yeah, it's the exact same reaction I had.
well, and there are people who like to talk about records management in the same breath as knowledge management, and that's always stumped me.
Well, I sort of understand. My wife is a records manager and archivist. So we've been together for 27 years. So I can see where our fields come together. But yeah, she agrees with you too. There's a difference. There's a big difference. Yeah.
It's the social part of it that gets left out. And in fact, I've always preferred the behavioral part of KM, and that it's more the introducing those behaviors and how to get them to stick and how to engage people in these kind of things. And I feel like the tools are a means to an end. My current colleague, however, I think she looks at knowledge management as the tools. So
Mhm.
I mean, I guess they're just different ways of thinking about it, but.
Yep.
I'd just like to say something about top down versus bottom up. I don't think they're, so take two things. One, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I mean, even if they're bottom up, you're going to need some executive sponsorship there. You're going to need
That's
some
true.
from the top. If the decree comes down from the top, then you're going to need some kind of groundswell to keep grow the community and maintain it.
Mhm.
What I think is bad top down and bad bottom up, or weak bottom up. You know, it's bad top down. Someone issues the decree and walks away. I've had great top down community management experience where the person has made the decree, but provided the money and stepped in and modeled behavior that he and she want to have mirrored. You know, it's no use saying, it's no use the CEO saying, or the VPs of marketing saying, you shall all use Yammer and all use Twitter, and then he sends an email out. You know, if you want everyone to use Yammer, make the announcement on Yammer. So there's bad top down and good top down. There's also bad bottom up in that,
Mhm.
people in the community have it's a great social network, and everyone's very close and the interaction is great, but they're producing nothing. To me, that's not a great community. It's a great social club, but especially from a community of practice, if you're not producing anything of value to the organization, then that's a waste of time.
Yeah.
I view it as a professional development opportunity and an opportunity for the exchange of tacit knowledge. To me, that's a valuable outcome.
Oh yeah, that's a total. That's one of the key things. One of the key values on the member side. So I always look for communities. I always look is the question you have to answer is what's in it for me.
Mhm.
If you're the member, what's in it for me as a member, or what's in it for if you're the organization, what's in it for me as the organization. So as a member, professional advancement, credibility, reputation, those are key motivators for community. So I totally agree with you, Tori.
So Jamie, since our topic is social psychological safety, and we're talking, I think that there's an interesting intersection here. And talking about these top-down communities, if this is just what you're tasked to do, and it still has value, and I like these ideas we're talking about, that we can talk about the professional development you'll get from it. We get to do a kind of scan about what everybody across the organization is doing on this particular topic and capture that. So do you need psychological safety to build a top-down community, or, what is that one of the elements that could be missing if it's top down, or what do we all think about that?
I mean, for me, I think psychological safety is always ideal. I mean, I don't know how familiar you all are with Amy Edmondson's work and talking about psychological safety in teams, but I think, regardless of how the community forms, how a group forms, I think there's always benefit to having an environment where people feel safe to speak and share ideas. I think there's different levels of psychological safety, and there's different needs that you might have. I mean, I think that if you're in an organization and you're, to Ray's earlier point about how, there are people who just really want to protect their own IP. It's their ideas. They get credit for these things. They get status for their knowledge. That's an organizational thing, maybe a cultural thing. And, it doesn't necessarily mean they don't feel safe in the environment. It just means that that's how it works there. I will get credit for my things, and I don't feel this way. I'm not protective of my knowledge because I don't feel safe sharing. It's more about like, this is my property.
Yep.
And I think there's a difference then between that kind of environment and, versus other kind of community gatherings where if we are going to be collaborative and innovative, and we're, and that requires us to give pieces of ourselves in some way or another, And that certainly requires a level of trust among the other people, because psychological safety isn't just about, what are you going to do with my IP? It's like, what are you going to do to me as a person, as I'm contributing in this setting? Go ahead.
Jenny. I mean, I like what you're saying there. And a lot of what I do coaching, because I used to be an IT project manager and I'm involved with Agile. And I help set up Agile teams. And one of the things too is, I want to make sure I protect my IP, but also with psychological safety is, do I feel safe enough to try something new and actually go out there? And I do a lot of design thinking workshops. And one of the biggest issues I have with people is get over the hesitation of actually putting your ideas out. It may not be great at first. We all have bad ideas at first. There's all bad drafts. But do I feel safe enough to try something, maybe it's half baked, and have the team help me fully bake it? And I think that's really important. So when I come to communities of practice, I'm looking at it from the training development of how can I help people learn from each other and create the new knowledge? And I think, going back to when you were at, what Charles said here, with our top down and what Ray was saying, when we were doing the HR stat, I don't know if you know much about the HR stat program, but it was basically looking at the different agencies and how they were doing with their HR systems, their technology systems. And we started off by sending out a survey and examining what they were doing. And we basically gave them bad scores. And I say they, the agencies, and beat up on them. And then we said, now come to our community of practice and learn how to do better. And when I think about that, that's probably the worst way to create psychological safety, because we've already beaten up on you. And then we have our stars out there. Now come here and share knowledge with us. And we've already scared you. So I can see that as being one of the bad advantages, even top down or either going organic, but just we penalized you first and now we want you to do better. So learn from each other. That's one big thing I took from it. Don't ever do that again.
I'm reminded of all hands meetings from hell, where we have to develop the office's values. And I've got somebody else telling me what my values should be.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to just, now I can shut off the camera or just do something else because I'm at home. But to sit through one of those meetings is deadly.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a facilitated effort to draw that thing out of people, that's one thing. But I'm imagining a top-down community practice facilitated by the wrong person could be just awful, or even facilitated by the right person. But if the wrong person comes in to set the stage, to frame the whole thing, and is actually, I can just imagine getting a really bad taste in my mouth about that. I'm not that big gung ho person for whatever the most powerful manager in the room wants necessarily. I'll tend to mutter obscenities under my breath.
I am so there. Hey, Tara, you haven't spoken much. Would you like to tell us some ideas? And you're on mute.
That was a meme from 2020, like the most common thing that we heard. You're still on mute.
Let's see. What I know that at state, at some point, probably around the time of Colin Powell, he established the Office of E-Diplomacy, and E-Diplomacy pretty much did a lot of knowledge management kinds of things, mostly tools they created, which is fine, but it's not the whole picture, in my opinion. I know they created something like a 15-page document about how you create a community of practice. And you had to complete all of these things in order to do it. And of course, you do have a lot of naysayers. If you say you want to create a community of practice, you have so many people from different levels saying, well, they don't succeed and they don't do much. And you have to really, really be on it and do a lot of work to keep it going and get participation. And so of course, I was completely disincentivized to do anything like that. But as well as, 15-page document, most of my work at state was done grassroots, because I was in a division. I was like in a worker bee level, and I really tried to create some kinds of community just in like having knowledge sharing sessions, like regular knowledge sharing, where we actually got people together and they talked about things and learned and exchanged. It could have been on any topic. I had lunch and learn, and then eventually had link to learning, where we were sharing things across the entire world. And so it was so cool, because I would have a topic that somebody was speaking on and people were dialing in from Thailand, and and I was so excited, because I'm thinking I did that. I helped that happen. And I'm not sure if anybody else got excited like I did, but the fact that it was a place where people could depend on learning and asking questions, and that's where it gets to be, do people feel safe to ask questions? And we had a pretty open and tolerant interaction. There was never a problem, but it also was a real, I felt very valued in that, because it's hard to get people to share information anywhere. So the fact that I was able to facilitate that, I thought was great. I think creating opportunities for sharing, and then also giving people that confidence to say what they think, or give their opinion and accept others' opinion. Those kinds of just personal interactions are crucial for any of those kinds of things. So I never did create a community of practice at state, but but I do think they're really worthwhile if you can get people to accept it, not
So,
naysay.
Tara, I'm understanding from what you said that the way you encourage psychological safety and people sharing was encouraging people, like one-on-one interactions. Like, are there takeaways that you can mention that, cultivated that kind of sharing?
Well, I kind of was rebelling, I'm like, all right, I'm a knowledge manager. No one really knew what that was when I started in 2008. But as I was talking to, and the more I talked to people and what the situation was, I recognized the need for people to share knowledge with each other, and not just your coworkers. And the wider you can spread the net, the better result you have. But as far as psychological safety, I know that I tend to, you can disagree, or if you want to, I tend to be very real when I'm talking. And whenever I had these sessions, I would be like, what do you think? Trying to elicit participation. But many times people just chose not to. And because sometimes it's hard. Somebody is calling in from across the country or someplace. It's hard for them to be able to say, oh, I don't agree with that. Or we, of course, didn't do, our subjects often were based on work, some kind of work thing. And so that may be part of it, that I didn't encounter as much interaction. But I think as far as takeaways, I think it was something that was new, because people weren't used to people who wanted to just share for the sake of sharing. That's important. A lot of people don't realize how important it is. They don't really provide that. Of course, now it's harder and harder to share, but I'll tell you, since COVID, I have talked to more people who I never would have talked to had I never met. I met family members of my husband's that live in California. I've never been to California. I never would have met them in person, but I met them on Zoom. So it's amazing how we've kind of, we have this little silver lining that keeps popping up. It's like, oh, this is great, it's communication. But at the same time, we don't like the reason for it to have to do it, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but it was a good experience doing all that at state, definitely.
Terry, would you give me a little honest feedback? What would you say is the psychological safety quotient at the federal KM community? Is that feel safe? You've been involved for a while.
Oh yeah, yes, absolutely. Let's see. At first, I was a little intimidated because of the caliber of the knowledge management personnel that regularly attend the federal knowledge management community. It's really, it was a little intimidating at first, so I didn't talk all that much, but I think it is very encouraged that people say what they think. And I've never felt embarrassed or there was nothing like where it's shut down, out of hand. So it's a sense of trust has been building regularly. So
Good. I'm glad.
yeah, I think the way you run it is wonderful. Just FYI, it is
Disorganized.
Oh, no,
Brantley.
don't. No, it's really wonderful because in addition to a topic or a speaker who will talk about something, there are other things where we actually have community kind of cafe sharing of knowledge. And that's a big thing with meeting people, the cafe concept. People, I run knowledge cafes at state and I've attended them and I love them because they do those two things that everybody thinks is valuable. They're looking for meeting people and learning. And the cafes are great for both of those things. So it's part of the federal KM meetings, really. It's kind of great.
Well, as far as involving people, I mean, I think you all know perfectly well, there are always going to be concentric circles of participation in a community. There's the nerds who probably help run the group and are the people who are talking most of the time. And then there's the middle ring of people who will say a few things during a meeting and are active and lively. And then there's the people sitting around the edge who may not say anything. And we've historically, when we were meeting in person, we'd also have a contingent on the phone. And we'd have somebody who was really good at building that bridge. Ben Bruneau, particularly from NASA, is our Adobe Connect host. And, he would do a lot to, he would type who was talking into the chat, for example, for the benefit of the remote participants. And so that was really a fourth circle. But we had some very active people on the remote connections, even, before we were all remote. And the chat just lights up and it's one thing after another. And I really have to wonder how much they're listening to the conversation that's going on, because there's so much going on in the chat. And this morning was like that too. We had our January meeting today. But now that we're all remote, it's different. And it's only half or maybe 2/3 there without the in-person aspect, with all of its inefficiency and all of the driving across town or taking the train across town to get there and organizing the room and all that stuff you got to do to meet in person.
And then we all go to lunch together. That was fun too, because that's, breaking bread. Yeah. That's a huge connecting thing.
To say nothing of going to the bar afterwards.
Well, yeah.
I
I
have
see
to
Sandy
disagree
popped
with you,
up.
Soro, a little bit.
Hey, Sandy.
Disagree with you. I didn't have certainly didn't have the benefit of somebody including me in when I'm remote and there are 10 people on the room, and there was nothing worse than like, hey, I'm still here, or trying to butt into the conversation that's there. So to me, COVID, one of the great benefits of COVID, it's been a great leveler. And in fact, for a while, I had an advantage because working remotely for so long, I was now dealing with people who'd never worked remotely and didn't have a clue. And their connections were really bad. They were living in apartment blocks and all share, there's 100 people sharing one connection point. And so, I'm on fiber optic and hey, my feed is great. So it was, to me, it was a great leveling experience, and it was much more inclusive, and I found that the interaction was much greater for me personally, and I think everyone got the hang of it after a while. So to me, it was great. The hardest thing for me is for meetings, it's been good tonight, but usually with 10 or 12 people in the room, the hardest thing is to be able to jump in. It doesn't seem to be a way to say, hey, I want to speak now. And I've been in a few meetings where people are adopting CB radio techniques, and when they finish speaking, they go over. And I thought, that's really weird, They speaking like over. So I'll say over.
My husband does that every day. He's in school right now, and he goes to the Eisenhower School. So he's with mostly other military folks, and they're on teams. So anytime they're done speaking, they close themselves out like that.
So I want to give Sandy an opportunity. It looks like you want to say something.
So one of the reasons why I joined this session and the previous session on re-envisioning communities of practice is because I think, as I mentioned the last time, I previously worked with an organization that pretty much shut the door on communities of practice. This was an international organization. And the reason is similar to what some of Tara said. People who are the naysayers saying they're hard to maintain, they're a lot of work, all the negatives that you hear. And my organization, one of the internationals in Washington area, did take this position that, we had 50 out of them. If we didn't maintain them, they died. And so after a while, we closed them down. No, we did continue with and we did have success with other knowledge sharing activities, so like the lunch and learns and the brown bag lunches and the knowledge fairs and different type of outreach. But in terms of the community of practice, it was just a no-go. And so, as I said, one of the reasons why I joined was to see where I kept these 2 sessions was to hear other people's success stories. And I know Ray probably has some experience with this in terms of good success stories, because the World Bank probably has a better feel for communities of practice than some of its sister organizations. My feedback is I worked with an organization for which the conclusion was, let's not do them anymore. So for the people who have been doing them and have been doing them successfully, what are some of the highlights and success stories?
We're self-governing. In our case, self-governing is important for us, but we're like I said earlier, I don't know if you were on the call, but we're not officially sanctioned by any organization. We're people who kind of sneak away from our jobs for a few hours to do this, I think. I mean, some people write reports on how they spent their Friday with us, and they keep coming back. So I guess their bosses are accepting the reports, but we decide what we want to do. And it's actually, I mean, it had been a chair. The FBI originally hosted our group, chaired our group. Then NASA chaired our group, Ed Hoffman, and Ed handed the baton to me. But I have enjoyed a lot of support from several other people, and we're broadening it now. And we have an interim board now, and we're actually going to have a board election later this year, and we're putting together some working groups on governance on the online platform and on programs. But whether it's been one person cobbling stuff together, or two or three of us, or we're charting our own course.
But you know what, Toro?
To Ray's point, we're not making an effort to produce anything other than the professional development piece. I mean, we are making an effort on the KM job series, but that's what I would offer in terms of our approach to things. Is we're self-governing.
I think the bottom line, though, is that it's a group of people that really want to be there, and like you said,
we're all there by choice.
Huh?
We're all there by choice.
Right, exactly. And like you said, Bill, which is like the same thing. I know I've said this in KM strategies and everything. If you really offer something, they will come. So if it's clearly something that people want to be doing, and I would imagine that's the number one reason why it works, is you got the right people.
Actually, in this case, all of our communities of practice were demand driven. They were asked for, both for staff as well as the borrowing member countries staff, not just staff in DC, but staff in the borrowing member countries. And they thought it was glorious. But especially outside of Washington, DC, when the time came for somebody to step up and take a leadership role, that's when it died. So, other people would have had other experience, but that was the experience of my organization. Once we said, okay, we have given you the infrastructure, you have a platform, you have a library, we have put everything in it, you have the document share, but now we were paying a staff to do it. We're moving our staff to other things. Now it's yours. That's when it died.
Sandy, I want to ask you a question. I'm thinking about an experience I had when I was at the World Bank, and we facilitated this network for learning between countries. And, in 2000, it was a lot different than now, right? I mean, I think Skype had barely come out. So using the World Bank's video conferencing system, and we had all this infrastructure. And so there were paid positions. We were paid to develop this network, to keep things going, right? To facilitate committees on quality of the content, all that kind of stuff. And when the World Bank backed away a little bit and said, okay, now it's your turn. Who wants to do it? And it kind of died from there. So I'm wondering if it's also just right. It's the type of organization, and maybe it's the way these partners, the power relationships with the World Bank, with donor agencies, and what they expect from them and stuff like that. And that might figure in there.
You're absolutely right, because it was your sister organization further down New York Avenue,
Yeah.
So
yes,
we same experience, and as I said, that's why I'll pick up Ray on his offer. But that's so I see that both organizations had a similar experience, so that's interesting.
I think to me there are 3 or 4 keys. One, people have to care about the person that starts it, gets it going. They have to be passionate about it. And I look at all the people in the gallery today, and I think you're all passionate about what you do, and you'll do it. I mean, it's just the same as your local community. There is, my soccer team, there's a soccer mom. Without her, the team would fall apart. The scout troop, without the scout leader, the thing would fall. There's got to be somebody driving it. I think one of the big issues in community is lack of succession planning. And when that person goes, the community dies pretty quickly. That's kind of aside. So someone has to be passionate about it. I think the organization or leadership has to care about it, otherwise you're not going to get the funding. And I think thirdly, there has to be someone full-time. The communities, the successful communities of practice at the World Bank, we have 400. Some are very successful, some are just limping along, and there's a website there, and there's a bunch of documents there, and a few videos of some brown bag lunches. So, but the ones that are successful, they have a professional community manager, not necessarily full-time, 1 or 2 days a week, that are taking care of business and keeping, maintaining the website, driving people for getting speakers in, doing all the stuff that's needed to keep the things going. That's a lot of time. You cannot expect, the bank's leading economists to be doing that. They just don't have time to do that, but they can be called on to give a presentation maybe every 3 months. They can be called on for certain things, especially when it has some value to them. And so that's the fourth thing. There has to be some value there. What are people getting out of it? It kind of goes back to something I said earlier. You've got to answer the question, what's in it for me?
Yeah. And I want to jump off that because first of all, a real quick time check. We're at 8:12, so we got a little bit over 15 minutes left. Been a great discussion. Here's the thing I want to ask everyone here, since you guys are the experts on this. In my training, I have to justify my training all the time. So we have this return on investment. What's the impact of my training? And I like what you were just saying, Ray, about we got to show the value of this. How do I show the value of a community of practice? And I don't want to do it like we did at OPM, where we weren't too happy because we're not getting enough knowledge from you guys. We need to disband. And I want to see what, because I'm thinking, what can I say or what can I do to show people this is a good community of practice? We should keep it going.
Bill, I'm wondering about, does monitoring stuff matter in your sphere? Because I've taken learning evaluation approaches to use for communities of practice, and instead of just bums on seats, we do like a poll at the end of an event, a kind of pre and post. So based on the objectives, right, where do you feel like you were on the topic at the start of the session, and where are you now? And just by showing 80% or 80% of our sessions, 94% of the people say that they have gained 3 times the knowledge or whatever.
So my decision makers are interested. Well, that's great and wonderful, but what's the impact on an organization? Are my people better trained so they can achieve my strategic goals? So that's like level 1 and level 2 is what you're talking about. I get folks that want level 3 and level 4. Are they actually doing their job better? Are the customers happier?
Right.
And how much did it cost us, and was it effective? Were we making more money than we needed to?
Like level 3, I mean, you can go and have focus groups and interview people at certain intervals afterwards. But I want to say one last thing, and then I'll stop. There's an approach that I really like. Has anybody here heard about the modern workplace learning model?
The what?
Modern workplace learning. There's a woman named Jane Hart who has written about this, right? She has a website, HART, she's British. And so with that model, we look at learning, we used to think it was just about training. And now we know that we prefer, if we ask ourselves, how do you prefer to learn? You go and look something up online, you join a community of practice. So like 10% of the way we prefer to learn, according to her, is through formal training, and all the rest is other stuff. It's right, resources, social learning, and personal learning, like going online and stuff like that. So I see it as like part of a kind of a wider, a broader, a capacity building approach, that you need all of these. You 70% of what you think you learn in a training, you lose as soon as you walk out, like arguments like that. Let me let others contribute.
So I'll say one thing about evaluation and value. So the CMX is a big community organization, and they've just published their community industry study. And the #1 issue facing communities of practice and community managers, 60% of community managers responded as showing value to the organization. So this is a massive issue covering the bedeviling the whole community industry. And in fact, I just spent probably 12 weeks researching this and trying to get to the bottom of this and trying to find metrics for measuring community success. But it's all, you have to start at the other end. You have to start at what your stakeholders are trying to achieve. What is the organization trying to achieve? Whether it's increasing literacy or improvement in health or reduction in mortality in certain regions, whatever the objective is, you start from that. And this is standard theory of change. You know, what is the objective and what are the kind of activities that we need to do to achieve that objective? So if it's improved literacy scores, maybe the theory of change is, well, if we train more teachers, then more teachers will improve the literacy scores. So I'm kind of making these things up. And so what can community do? What can the community of practice do to improve the training of teachers? Well, we can improve greater awareness. Communities are great for improving awareness of products or of classes. And do teachers, will teachers get more training? Will train teachers be better? Will literacy scores go down? Go up? And then we have a problem of attribution. Well, there were lots of other factors improving literacy scores. You know, it was kind of grants from the government, or it was, yeah, we trained all the teachers, but the teachers didn't show up. They took the course and didn't show up. And you know, this is a big issue in the development world. But the general principle is start from the goal in mind. So one of the reasons for support communities being so successful is that there's a straight line between what the organization wants and what the community is doing. So the goal of the organization is to reduce the number of tech support calls. And so you have all these massive forums and millions of people on them and about 100 people answering questions. So the organizations can see the value because you can show that 100 people on the community answered 10,000 questions. 10,000 questions at $100 per question just saved the company $10 million. So there's a direct relationship between what the community is doing and what value the organization is getting out of it. Now, other communities, it's much, much harder. And most of our communities of practice, the goals are around awareness, adoption, and implementation, and following those through. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Etienne Wenger's work or not. He really wrote the Bible on cultivating communities of practice. Well, he's just written a new book on valuation and value creation stories, and how there are several levels of value creation from way at the beginning to impact at the end. And I'll track that down and put it in the chat here for you guys. But very, very, very good.
And I do support what you're saying. And in reference to the original question, I think the answers actually have been put forward. When we do training, if somebody asks, well, what's the value of training? We can give them the level 1 results. We can say 90% of students thought that they learned something. We can give them feedback. We have statistics for that. We do a pre and post test. We can tell them the learning gain was 15 percentage points. We can send them a follow-up survey, and we get the results saying, yeah, 80% of the people we trained to use Excel say they're using Excel on the job. And you may want to go even further and hire somebody to look at the impact of training. So we do all of that for training, and we have a training plan, and we have an evaluation plan in place. When it comes to communities of practice, you frequently don't have that. So in your case, Ray, you're saying you could draw a straight line between what the objectives were and what you were doing. And so, in terms of value, I think that's where the contribution is. When people are setting up a community of practice at the onset, there should be an evaluation plan. What are your objectives? How do you know your objectives are being achieved? And what is the evidence? And so at the end of the day, you will be able to provide that. So in summary, the lack of being able to show value for this community of practice is because there was not an evaluation plan at the outset where the goals and the metrics would have been agreed on prior to the start. And then you can say at the end of whatever your time frame is, these are our goals, this is what we achieved.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And a lot of the literature now talks about, sometimes it's hard to draw that straight line because of all the other factors, but and they talk about measuring contribution rather than giving attribution. So, you know, your community of practice made a contribution to the change in behavior or the indicators that you're talking about, whether it's sanitation or literacy or political participation, whatever the goal is, at least you can trace back something that the community did that contributed to this change in behavior or change in circumstances.
Very good.
In the federal KM community, you know, I think we'd be judged a success when somebody learns about building knowledge management in their organizations. You know, you look at why people come is, you know, they want to learn about, you know, they want to get a better handle on what this thing is, but but after they've got that, you know, we've got a lot of people who want to build a program, or at least they're researching building programs, and you know, they have an opportunity to talk to a lot of people who are doing it and have done it. And you know, if they go out and are then able to apply some of what they learned in putting a program together that they wouldn't have been able to do without it, that's a pretty tangible result. And at a more micro level, you know, when we were meeting in person for at least the last year of our in-person meetings, and probably a little longer, we were every afternoon, we would have our quarterly meetings were 6 hours on Fridays. In the afternoon, we would always take an hour to do 2 sessions of user requested breakouts. You know, everybody would say, what do you want to talk about in the breakouts? What do you want to learn more about? If it's promoting KM, or if it's starting a KM program, or ideas for KM Awareness Week, one of Tara's brainstorms. And then we'd vote on these topics right before lunch, and we'd come back and say, okay, these are the top 2. We're going to do a half hour. We're going to do a 20-minute breakout and a 10-minute report on each of these in the afternoon, so that somebody could come in with specific questions. And if they made a good enough pitch and got them into the top 2 on the list, they'd have a bunch of people focusing on their thing, and they'd really go out of there with something that they could use back at the office on Monday. At my place of employment, 2 of our newest communities are a data analytics community, and we've got people from all over our tiny agency participating in this to learn to use MicroStrategy and some of the other analytics tools that we've all got access to now. And they are producing things using these tools that they would not be doing, at least to the extent they are, without the support and learning that takes place in the community. And we have a real estate community of practice where we make grants, you know, to transit agencies, and there's real estate transactions that are often involved in putting in a new bus barn somewhere, or certainly buying right of way for a light rail line. And you know, this was the program office that initiated this. This was kind of a top-down community. You know, the idea was get people talking, improve the general understanding of this particular discipline. And the tangible results are a lessening of questions, and just a general better understanding across the agency. The real estate guys at headquarters are getting fewer emails and calls with questions about things because people are involved in the community and they just understand it better. I mean, these are obvious, but they're tangible benefits.
Real quick time check. We've got 5 minutes left. So want to kind of let Tara and Jamie kind of have the last word. So Jamie or Tara?
I was just going to mention reducing attrition because like this whole social interaction is something that may end up making people want to stay in their job, or one of the factors.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, because I'm always thinking about that, and that's another HR thing. Like, that's where HR can say, okay, we've been losing a lot of personnel. I know it's different with government, but of course you know, sometimes you just don't want people to leave. They're good people, and a community can help them be heard and give them that incentive to stay.
Mhm.
That was what I was thinking of. But yeah, I'll let Jamie finish with the last word, because Jamie's been a wonderful deputy chair of of this community. But I want to thank everybody for coming out and joining this conversation, and I hope to see you again at our monthly meetings, because we definitely try and do it every month, and normally it's on a Thursday, and this is a new time. We're trying to be able to get more people to be able to come. So but thank you for attending. So over to you, Jamie.
Thanks. So I want to say also just thank you for the great conversation and all the great resources that were shared. And I think, you know, another thing I just wanted to encourage people, as you think of resources or people that we might look at, definitely post that in the meetup group for us and folks that weren't able to attend. I think that's really helpful. And I also wanted to encourage everyone to come. I just added it to the meetup group, but next month, on Thursday, the 25th, John Hovel and Danita Bolquin will be our guest speakers, and they'll be talking about conversational leadership, which, if you're not familiar with that through David Gertein's work or John and Danita's work, I think it's a great topic to continue this conversation with, because, you know, now we're really talking about these dynamics. Like, I heard certain things in this conversation about Toro was mentioning, and Bill was mentioning things about having people who, you know, can lead and guide. And what's interesting about conversational leadership is it sort of poses this question of, you know, do you need a person to be doing that, or can you have your entire community be given the agency to do that and be motivated to lead the community on their own? And, you know, and that kind of all starts with asking these few simple questions that John and Danita will talk about, but very intriguing way to think about sort of community from this whole different angle. So hopefully you can join us in February. And that's all I really have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Have
See
a
you
great
later.
night.
Thank you for watching KMCDC's presentation. Hope to see you at the next monthly meeting.